Dad, do you know what the best birthday gift would be? If you just disappeared forever. The words pierced me like a blade pressed straight into my chest. My daughter, Emily, my only child, stood there in her elegant dress, holding a glass of champagne, as if she were making a casual remark about the weather. She didn't laugh afterward, didn't soften her voice. She meant every syllable. I froze. 72 years of living, of breaking my back under the weight of factory machines, of saving every penny so she could have a better life, and this was the gift I received in return. My legs shook as though they were no longer mine. I couldn't even set down the birthday cake I had brought for her without feeling my hands tremble like branches in a storm. I wanted to believe I misheard her, but the coldness in her eyes told me otherwise. That day, something inside me cracked, but it wasn't weakness, it was the start of something new. I never imagined that her cruel words would awaken a new man inside me, and that was only the beginning of a journey Emily would never see coming. My name is Daniel. I am 72 years old. My hair turned silver long ago, my back curved slightly with time, and my hands bear the marks of 4 decades spent turning bolts, lifting steel, and wiping away grease in a truck factory. I was never a rich man, but I was steady. I was tall once, broad-shouldered and strong, but now I am lean, almost fragile to the outside eye. Still, inside me lives the same man who worked double shifts just to make sure his daughter never went hungry, who swallowed his pride when the foreman barked at him, who believed that every drop of sweat was worth it if it meant Emily had one more step ahead in life. Emily is my only child. She is 45 now, slim, stylish, her blonde hair a shade too bright to be natural but still suiting her high society image. To the world, she is successful, a woman who married well, lives in a grand suburban house with a sprawling yard, and hosts parties with champagne and silk dresses. People call her elegant, accomplished, independent. But when I look at her, I don't just see that polished image. I see the little girl who once sat on my shoulders as I carried her through county fairs, the child who used to cry for me in the middle of the night, the teenager who once called me her hero. And maybe that is the cruelest part, because I remember when she adored me. There was a time when I was her entire world. She would clutch my hand and refuse to let go when I dropped her off at school. She would wave at me from the stands at her softball games, grinning when she spotted me. On her prom night, she twirled in her dress and asked, "Dad, do I look like a princess?" I told her she looked even more beautiful, and I meant it with all my heart. Those moments are etched into me like carvings on stone, unerasable no matter how hard time or betrayal tries to grind them away. Life, however, has a way of twisting the stories we thought we controlled. When Emily married David, I thought I was giving her to a man who would protect her, who would cherish her as fiercely as I did. I gave $35,000 for that wedding money I had saved for decades. I told myself it was worth it, because seeing her walk down the aisle with tears in her eyes and joy in her smile made me believe I had done something right. But somewhere along the way, the girl who once called me her hero started seeing me as a burden. She stopped answering my calls as quickly. She stopped visiting me in my old apartment, the one with peeling wallpaper and squeaky floors. She no longer asked for advice, no longer sought my approval. Instead, she let her world orbit around money, appearances, and the approval of others. The irony is that the very house she flaunts, the one she fills with parties and expensive furniture, sits on a foundation I built for her. When David lost his job and the mortgage loomed like a guillotine, I dipped into my retirement savings, $150,000. That was the down payment. Without me, they would have lost that house before they even settled into it. But no one who visits them knows that. No one who compliments her home realizes that an old man in a cheap apartment made it possible. I live simply. My apartment smells faintly of oil and old wood. The furniture is second-hand, the curtains faded, the air conditioner clunky and loud, yet every penny I saved, I funneled toward Emily. Her medicine when she was a sick child, her braces, her summer camps, her college tuition. I lived on peanut butter sandwiches for weeks so she could have a prom dress that shimmered under the gymnasium lights. I sold my truck, the one thing I truly loved besides her, to cover medical bills when she was 3 years old and fighting pneumonia. I carried her through every storm, no matter how hard it battered me. But sacrifices have a strange way of reshaping people. Instead of gratitude, Emily began to twist my giving into a weapon against me. She once told me that all my help was suffocating, that I used money as a way to control her life. Her words sliced deeper than she knew. I never wanted to control her. I only wanted to protect her. But in her eyes, my devotion became chains. My sacrifices became debts. She resented. Instead of treasures, she cherished. I suppose, looking back, the signs were there before her cruel birthday remark. The way she would sigh when I asked about her day. The way she avoided eye contact when I mentioned her mother, who passed away decades ago. The way she only called when she needed something babysitting for the twins, a loan, a co-signature. Each time I gave in, each time I said yes, believing it was my duty as a father. Perhaps I should have learned to say no earlier. Perhaps I should have drawn boundaries. But love blinded me, and I thought being a father meant giving until I had nothing left. That morning, when I walked into her home with a chocolate cake in hand, I had no idea my world was about to collapse. Chocolate was her favorite when she was a girl. I can still remember her face lighting up when I brought it home after a long shift, her fingers smeared with frosting as she giggled. Spending $200 on that cake now felt like nothing compared to the joy I imagined it would bring. I thought foolishly that for one moment she would look at me like she once did, with warmth, with love. Instead, she looked at me with disdain, as though I were a stain on her perfect world. Her house, though beautiful, felt colder than any factory floor I had worked on. Marble countertops gleamed, crystal glasses sparkled, but not a shred of warmth lived in those walls. And in the middle of that sterile beauty, my daughter told me that the best gift would be if I vanished from her life forever. I cannot describe the weight of that moment. It was not just the words, it was the truth they carried. Emily no longer saw me as a father. She saw me as an obstacle, a shadow, something to erase. And in that instant, every sacrifice I had ever made threatened to unravel. But life has a peculiar way of writing chapters we never expect. What I didn't realize that morning was that her cruelty would not be the end of me. It would be the beginning of something entirely different. When I stepped into Emily's living room that morning, I felt like I was crossing into a world that no longer had space for me. The place was spotless, almost intimidating in its perfection. The polished hardwood floors gleamed like they had never known the scuff of shoes. The walls were adorned with sleek, modern art pieces that looked more expensive than everything I owned combined. The air carried the faint aroma of roses, mixed with something synthetic, something meant to impress guests, but not to comfort a family. I couldn't help but feel like an outsider in the very home I had sacrificed my life to help pay for. I carried the chocolate cake with both hands, gripping it tightly, not because it was heavy, but because it carried more meaning than anyone in that house could understand. It wasn't just sugar and frosting, it was memory. When Emily was little, her eyes used to light up at the sight of a chocolate cake, her laughter ringing through our tiny kitchen as she smeared frosting across her cheeks. Back then, all it took to make her happy was that simple treat. Spending $200 on a cake at my age was a stretch, but I told myself it was worth it. Maybe, just maybe, this small gesture would remind her of the bond we once shared. Emily greeted me at the door, but not like a daughter greeting her father. She wore a polite smile, the kind you offer to a neighbor you barely know. There was no hug, no warmth in her eyes. She didn't reach for the cake, didn't even ask how I was. She just stepped aside, allowing me in with the kind of indifference you give to a delivery man dropping off a package. For a moment, I told myself she was just distracted. Maybe she was busy with the party. Maybe her mind was elsewhere. I tried to excuse it, tried to believe she didn't mean to be so cold. Inside, the house was buzzing with chatter. Friends and colleagues gathered around with their champagne glasses, laughing too loudly at jokes that weren't funny. I stood in the corner, cake still in my hands, and felt the weight of every pair of eyes that darted my way and then quickly looked elsewhere. Nobody approached me. Nobody asked who I was. To them, I was just an old man standing awkwardly in a room too polished for someone like me. Finally, I approached Emily, hoping to break through her wall of indifference. "Happy birthday, sweetheart," I said softly, offering the cake with a trembling smile. "Do you remember when you were little and this was all you wanted? Chocolate cake with extra frosting." She glanced at it, and in that moment her lips curved, but not into the kind of smile I had prayed for. It was half a smirk, half annoyance, colder than the marble countertop beside us. Then she said the words that broke me. "The best gift would be if you just disappeared." For a second, the world stopped. My breath caught in my throat, my grip on the box faltered, and I nearly dropped it. Her voice was calm, casual even, but her eyes burned with something harder than stone. She wasn't joking, she wasn't lashing out in a moment of frustration. She meant every word. "Emily," I whispered, my voice cracking under the weight of her cruelty. "How could you say that to me?" Her shoulders stiffened. She set her champagne glass down with a sharp clink, the sound cutting through the noise of the room like a blade. Then she turned to face me fully, her jaw tight, her words sharp enough to slice through bone. "Do you know what it feels like, Dad? To live your whole life with someone hanging over you. You've always been there, reminding me of your sacrifices, of what you gave up for me. It's suffocating. I can't breathe. You gave too much, and now I feel trapped by it." Her words hit harder than any blow I had ever known. My mind reeled, racing through the years, through every sacrifice I had made. Selling my truck to pay for her medicine when she was 3 years old. Working night shifts to save up for her prom dress. Mortgaging my house so she could go to college without debt. Covering 8 months of mortgage payments when her husband lost his job. Babysitting her twins for free, even when my body ached and my energy was gone. I thought each act of love had built a bridge between us. Instead, she saw those acts as shackles. I swallowed hard, my chest burning. "Emily, everything I did it for you. So you could have this life, so you wouldn't have to suffer the way I did." Her response was immediate, sharp, unyielding. "That's exactly the problem. You never let me live my life. Every dollar you gave me came with strings. Every time you helped, it was a reminder of what you sacrificed. It's not love, Dad. It's control, and I'm tired of it." I felt the blood drain from my face. Around us, her friends pretended not to listen, but I could feel their eyes flicking toward us, their curiosity prickling the air. My humiliation was on display, my heartache turned into a spectacle. I wanted to shout, to scream the truth that I never asked for repayment, never demanded recognition. I wanted to tell them that I had given everything out of love, not power, but my throat tightened, trapping the words inside. I looked at the cake still in my hands. It felt heavy now, unbearably heavy. I set it down on the counter, my fingers trembling as though I were laying down not just a dessert, but the remnants of a bond that no longer existed. The chocolate frosting gleamed under the light, untouched, unwanted, just like me. Emily didn't soften. She didn't reach for my hand or apologize for the sting of her words. She turned away, already rejoining her guests, already slipping back into her world of shallow laughter and champagne. I stood there in silence, invisible in a house I had helped save, in a life I had built for her. I thought of the tiny apartment where I lived, of the quiet nights alone, with nothing but the hum of my old refrigerator to keep me company. And I realized then, with a sharpness that cut through every vein in me, that to Emily I was no longer a father. I was a shadow, a burden, a ghost haunting the edges of her perfect life. That night, long after I left her house, I sat in my apartment with tears soaking into my hands. I thought grief would drown me, but slowly, as the hours passed and the silence wrapped around me, the tears dried. And where grief had been, something else began to stir, not sorrow, but something darker, sharper. It was determination. Her words had cut me down, but they had also awakened something I didn't know I still had. I realized I could no longer live as the man who gave endlessly and received nothing in return. I didn't know it yet, but Emily's cruelty had set me on a path that neither she nor I could have foreseen. That night, after the party, I couldn't sleep. I sat in my old recliner with the television flickering in the background, but I wasn't watching. My mind replayed Emily's words over and over like a cruel recording stuck on repeat. The best gift would be if you just disappeared. Every syllable lodged itself into my chest. It wasn't just what she said, it was how she said it. Cold, detached, final. The silence of my apartment pressed down on me like a weight. The hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the old pipes, the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, they all reminded me of how empty my life had become. I had given so much to Emily, to her family, to the life she now enjoyed, that I had nothing left for myself. My body was tired, my spirit worn thin, and yet I still longed for her approval, her love. That realization stung the most. Memories came flooding back, uninvited but relentless. I remembered the night she was 3 years old, burning with fever so high, I thought I would lose her. The doctor said she needed medicine we couldn't afford. I sold my old truck, the only thing I had bought for myself after years of saving just to pay for it. I can still see her tiny body curled under the blankets, her skin pale, her breath shallow. When the medicine finally broke her fever, I thought I had won a war. I told myself that no price was too high if it meant keeping her alive. Then came the years of scraping by. I worked nights at the factory, dragging my body home in the early hours, grease still clinging to my skin. Some nights I could barely stand, but when Emily needed a prom dress, I found the strength. I remember holding that shimmering gown in my hands, knowing it cost more than a month of my rent, but also knowing she would step into that gymnasium and feel like she belonged, like she was worth something. The look on her face when she twirled in front of the mirror made every ache vanish. At her wedding, I sat in the front row, tears streaming down my face as I watched her walk down the aisle. I had poured $35,000 into that day. It was money I could have used to finally rest, to patch the cracks in my ceiling, to maybe take a trip I had always dreamed of. But seeing her in that white dress, glowing, happy, was all I ever wanted. I thought she understood then. I thought she knew what I had done for her. When David lost his job years later, the panic in her voice over the phone was enough for me to open my savings without hesitation. 8 months of mortgage payments, I covered them all. I told myself it was temporary, that they would get back on their feet. And when the twins were born, I stepped into the role of babysitter, cook, chauffeur, whatever they needed. My body ached, my joints screamed, but I did it. I told myself it was love. But sitting there that night, with Emily's cruel words echoing in my ears, all those sacrifices twisted into something darker. She hadn't seen them as love. She had seen them as control, as chains. She believed I had used my giving as a way to trap her. That realization cut deeper than any wound I had ever endured. The next morning, I called Emily, hoping to clear the air. I told myself maybe she had spoken in anger, maybe she regretted it. When she answered, her voice was clipped, rushed. Before I could even finish my sentence, she interrupted. "Dad, I don't want to go over this again. You've always made everything about what you did for me. I just want to live my life without feeling like I owe you." Her dismissal left me speechless. For decades, I had lived by the belief that love meant sacrifice, that a parent's duty was to give without question. Now, my own daughter told me that love had suffocated her. For days, I wrestled with that truth. I tried to understand her perspective, tried to see myself through her eyes. Maybe I had overstepped. Maybe I had given too much, too often. But then another thought crept in, one that grew louder with each passing day. Maybe it wasn't my giving that was the problem. Maybe it was her inability to accept it. Maybe gratitude had left her long ago, replaced by entitlement. That thought hardened into certainty when I remembered the way she looked at me during the party, not with anger, not with hurt, but with disdain, as though I were beneath her, a relic she no longer needed. That look told me everything I needed to know. I realized then that I couldn't keep living this way. I couldn't keep giving until I was nothing, only to be treated like an anchor dragging her down. For the first time in my life, I began to think not about what Emily needed, but about what I needed. That night, As I sat in the silence of my apartment, I felt something shift inside me. The grief was still there, heavy and raw, but beneath it was a spark of something I hadn't felt in years: resolve. I whispered to myself, if she wants me gone, then maybe it's time I finally take myself out of her world. Not as a punishment, but as a liberation for both of us. And with that thought, a plan began to take shape. The plan began not with anger, but with clarity. I realized that if I continued as I had, I would die a man drained of every ounce of dignity. Emily had taken and taken, and I had given willingly, but now I saw how one-sided it had all become. Love was no longer a bond between us. It had turned into a transaction she resented, even as she relied on it. I started with memories, because memories shape resolve. I thought back to Emily's first day of college. She had wanted to attend a prestigious university far from home, and the tuition was staggering. I had stood in the bank, signing papers to mortgage my house, just so she could walk into that lecture hall without debt crushing her. I can still remember the pride on her face when she showed me her dorm room, her excitement when she said, "Dad, this is the start of my future." I smiled and told her I was proud, but inside I knew I had traded my own future for hers. Now, decades later, that sacrifice had curdled into resentment, not from me, but from her. She had rewritten the story, casting me not as the father who gave, but as the man who chained her down. And the memories didn't stop there. Her wedding day replayed in my mind like an old film reel. The joy in her smile, the tears in my eyes, the whispered thanks she gave me before walking down the aisle. Where had that gratitude gone? Had it evaporated in the glow of wealth and status, replaced by the belief that love comes without cost, without effort? The more I thought, the more my pain transformed. It didn't become anger, it became steel. A father cannot control his child's heart, but he can control his own choices. And for the first time in years, I decided to make choices for myself. I went to the bank first. Walking through those glass doors, I felt both nervous and empowered. I withdrew $20,000 from the joint account Emily had access to, money I had once thought of as our emergency fund. But why should I keep it there when she had already declared me unwanted? That money was mine, earned through decades of sweat. I held the cashier's check in my hands and felt a strange calm, as if I were reclaiming a part of myself. From the bank, I walked straight into my lawyer's office. The man had been handling my small affairs for years, never once seeing me as anything more than a simple retiree. But that day, I surprised him. I told him I wanted to rewrite my will. My estate, modest as it was, would no longer go to Emily. Instead, I would leave it to charity. And more importantly, I would establish a trust fund for my grandchildren, untouchable until they turned 25. They would inherit something pure, something meant for their future, free of their mother's hands. My lawyer looked at me carefully, as though he saw for the first time a man who knew exactly what he wanted. Then came the final step, the house. The very house where Emily had humiliated me, where she had spoken those words that cut so deep. I dug out the old mortgage papers and read them carefully. There it was in black and white, my name, co-signer, legally tied to the very foundation of her life. I had rights I had long ignored for her sake. But now I understood that those rights were not chains holding me back. They were tools she never imagined I would use. When I returned to my apartment that evening, I felt lighter, as if years of burden had slipped from my shoulders. For the first time in decades, I wasn't thinking of what Emily wanted or how to please her. I was thinking of myself. I was thinking of justice. The days that followed were quiet, but within me, a storm brewed. Emily called once, casually asking if I could watch the twins over the weekend. Her tone was dismissive, as though our last conversation had never happened, as though she hadn't told me she wished I would disappear. That was when I realized the depth of her entitlement. She believed my role in her life was fixed, that no matter what she said or did, I would always bend, always comply. But not this time. "Emily," I said firmly, my voice steady, "you told me you wanted me gone. Well, I'm starting now. I won't be coming over this weekend." There was a pause, the silence thick and heavy. Then she laughed, a short, incredulous sound. "Oh, come on, Dad. Don't be dramatic. You know I didn't mean it like that. The kids need you." And her words stung, but I held my ground. "I'm sure they'll manage. You're their mother. It's time you figured it out without me." I hung up before she could reply. My hand shook slightly as I set the phone down, but it wasn't from weakness, it was from adrenaline, from the rush of finally saying no. That night, I slept better than I had in years. My dreams were not haunted by regret or by the echo of her cruel words. Instead, I dreamed of standing on a mountain, wind in my face, no longer weighed down by chains I had forged myself. What I didn't know then was that my refusal, my small act of defiance, was only the beginning. Emily would not let go so easily. She would soon realize that the world she had built on my back was beginning to crumble, and for once I was ready to watch the storm come. The morning after I refused to babysit for Emily, I woke up with an unusual stillness in my chest. For years, my mornings had been filled with worry, whether she needed money, whether the twins were sick, whether David had found work again. But that day, when I opened my eyes to the faded ceiling of my small apartment, the first thought that entered my mind was not about them, it was about me. For the first time in decades, I felt the faintest taste of freedom. I poured myself a cup of black coffee and sat by the window, watching the traffic crawl past. My hands still shook, but not from weakness. It was adrenaline, the kind I hadn't felt since I was a younger man, standing up to a foreman who had cheated me on my hours. Back then, I had swallowed my pride because I needed the job. But now, there was nothing left to lose. My daughter had already told me she wished I would disappear. So maybe it was time to vanish, but not in the way she expected. I started digging through my old files. They were stuffed in cardboard boxes, buried under coats and rusted tools, papers yellowed with age. I spread them across the table, bank statements, mortgage contracts, insurance policies. Each page felt like a piece of my life, fragments I had ignored because I had always been too busy thinking about Emily. But as I read through them, my chest swelled with a strange kind of power. These weren't just scraps of paper. They were proof that I still had rights, still had a voice. The first step was the bank. I remember the look on the young teller's face when I slid the withdrawal slip across the counter. $20,000. Her eyebrows lifted slightly, probably wondering what an old man like me would do with that kind of money. I didn't bother explaining. When she handed me the cashier's check, I held it carefully, like a shield I had just forged. It wasn't much by today's standards, but it was mine. For too long, I had thought of that money as Emily's safety net. Now I saw it clearly. It was the last of my strength, and I wasn't going to leave it in her reach any longer. From there, I walked to my lawyer's office. The leather chairs, the oak desk, the certificates framed neatly on the wall. They all made me feel small, like a mechanic trespassing in a world built for men with softer hands and heavier wallets. But I sat down across from him anyway. "I want to change my will," I said firmly. He looked up, startled. "Daniel, are you sure? That's no small decision." "I've never been more certain," I said. "Emily will get nothing. I want my estate left to charity, and I want to set up a trust for my grandchildren. They can't touch it until they're 25, and Emily will have no access to it." For a long time, he just studied me, as though he was meeting a different man than the one he'd known for years. Finally, he nodded. "All right, let's do this properly." As I signed the papers, a weight slid off my chest. For decades, my identity had been tied to Emily, to giving until I was hollow. With each stroke of the pen, I felt that identity cracking, giving way to something new. I was no longer just her father. I was a man who had finally decided his life still belonged to himself. But the most powerful revelation came later, at home, as I read through the old mortgage papers. My name was there, bold as ever, next to Emily's and David's. Co-signer. My hands trembled as I traced the letters with my finger. That house, the very place where Emily had humiliated me, stood partly on my back. Without me, it wouldn't even exist in their lives. For years, I had ignored that fact, telling myself I didn't want control, that it was enough just to see Emily happy. But now I saw the truth. I wasn't powerless. I had been holding leverage all along. That realization burned through me like fire. She thought she had erased me, cast me aside as if I were nothing. But she had no idea that her life was still tied to mine by ink and paper. Her words had tried to bury me, but in reality, they had awakened me. A few days later, Emily called again. Her voice was brisk, as though our last exchange hadn't left a scar. "Dad, can you come by Saturday? We've got a dinner event, and we need someone to stay with the twins." Oh, it was the entitlement in her tone that struck me most. No hesitation, no softening, just an expectation that I would say yes. My grip on the phone tightened. I could almost hear her scoffing at me from across the line, already planning her evening without concern for how I felt. "No, Emily," I said, my voice steady. "I won't be coming." There was silence on the line, then a sharp laugh. "What do you mean you won't? You always do." "Not anymore," I replied. "You told me you wanted me gone. I'm just respecting your wishes." The air crackled with her disbelief. "Oh, for God's sake, Dad, don't be dramatic. You know I didn't mean it like that. The kids need you. The kids need their parents," I said softly, "not a grandfather who's treated like a burden." And before she could argue further, I hung up. My hand trembled as I set the phone down, but this time it wasn't from guilt. It was from the rush of finally saying no. For years I had been afraid of disappointing her, of losing what little connection we had left. But that night, as I sat in my quiet apartment, I felt lighter than I had in decades. I wasn't drowning in regret. I wasn't replaying her cruel words. Instead, I felt the spark of dignity returning to me. The next few days brought more calls, first polite, then impatient, then furious. David came knocking once, trying to appeal to my sense of duty. "She didn't mean it," he said, shifting uncomfortably in his suit jacket. "You know how stressed she gets. The kids adore you. Don't punish them." I looked him in the eye and said calmly, "Your wife made her choice. I'm just honoring it." Then I closed the door. Inside, my heart raced, but it wasn't from fear, it was from triumph. Each refusal was a brick in the wall I was building between myself and their endless demands. For so long, I had believed being a father meant giving without end, even when it destroyed me. But now, I understood something I should have known long ago. Love cannot survive without respect. And Emily had long since stopped respecting me. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the cracks in my ceiling, I whispered to myself, "This is not the end. This is the beginning." I had thought her words would break me. Instead, they had set me free. The shift in me did not go unnoticed. Within days, Emily's tone began to change. At first, she tried to brush it off as though nothing had happened, calling me with her usual list of requests: rides for the twins, money for a temporary expense, babysitting on short notice. Each time I refused. Each time her voice grew sharper, more incredulous. For years, I had been predictable, pliable, willing to bend until I nearly broke. Now, my defiance startled her. One evening, she called again. I answered, already knowing what was coming. "Dad, the twins have soccer this weekend, and David and I have a work trip. Can you cover for us?" "No, Emily," I said evenly. "I told you before, I'm not available." Her sigh came heavy through the line. "Why are you acting like this? You've always been there for me, for us. Now you suddenly think you're too good to help your own family." "Too good?" I repeated, my voice low but firm. "Emily, I gave you my life. I worked until my body broke down. I paid for your medicine, your schooling, your wedding, even the roof over your head. And you told me the best gift I could give you was to disappear. Well, I'm giving you that gift now." She was silent for a moment, then snapped, "You're being manipulative. This isn't you. Someone's gotten into your head." "No," I replied softly. "This is me, finally speaking with my own voice." For once, I didn't let her anger swallow me. I ended the call. and for the first time in years, I didn't second-guess myself afterward. But Emily was not a woman to surrender easily. The next day, David showed up at my apartment. He looked different from the man I once respected, the one I had welcomed into my family. His suit was wrinkled, his face lined with worry. When I opened the door, he forced a smile. "Daniel," he said carefully, "can we talk?" I stepped aside, allowing him in. He glanced around my modest apartment, the peeling wallpaper, the second-hand furniture, and I saw pity flicker across his face. He cleared his throat. "Look, she's under a lot of pressure. She didn't mean what she said at her party. You know how she gets. But the kids, they miss you. You're their grandfather. They need you." I leaned back in my chair, folding my arms. "David, I've been more than a grandfather. I've been their babysitter, their safety net, their emergency fund. I've been everything but their parent. And I'm done." His jaw tightened. "So you're just going to abandon them, after everything?" "Don't twist my words," I said calmly. "I'm not abandoning anyone. I'm stepping back because your wife made it clear she doesn't want me around. I'm just respecting her wishes." His eyes hardened. "Emily doesn't know about the will, does she?" I looked at him steadily. "She will soon enough." That was the first time I saw fear cross his face. He knew what losing my support meant. Without my name on that house, without my money to patch their holes, their world would start to collapse. He tried to argue further, but I stood and opened the door. "This conversation is over, David." As he left, I felt a tremor of guilt. The twins were innocent in all of this. They didn't deserve to be caught in the storm between their mother and me. But I also knew that shielding Emily from consequences any longer would only tighten the chains around my own neck. Sometimes, the hardest act of love is letting someone face the cost of their choices. A week later, the inevitable happened. Emily found out about the changes in my will. She stormed into my apartment without knocking, her heels clicking angrily against the worn floor. Her face was flushed, her voice sharp as she spat the words, "How dare you? After everything I've done for you, you cut me out? You're leaving everything to strangers and locking my own children's future away from me." I stood slowly, meeting her fury with calm. "Yes, Emily, because you told me you don't want what I've given. You called my love suffocating, my sacrifices control. So I'm giving you freedom, complete freedom. From my money, from my protection, from me." "And Villy." Her eyes widened, her chest heaving with rage. "This isn't freedom, Dad. This is revenge." I shook my head. "No, this is respect. Respecting your wish to live without me. But don't mistake this. Freedom comes with consequences. You wanted me gone. Now you have to face life without my safety net." She looked at me as though she didn't recognize me. For years, I had been the father who bent, who yielded, who quietly absorbed every blow. Now I was unshakable, and it terrified her. When she finally left, slamming the door behind her, I sat back down in my chair. My heart pounded, my hands trembled, but not from fear, from release. I had faced her rage, her accusations, and I had not broken. For the first time in my life, I walked away from my daughter, not out of weakness, but out of strength. And though I carried sadness, deep and raw, I also carried something far more powerful, the sense that I was finally living my life on my own terms. The days that followed were like walking through a storm I had long feared, yet strangely, I felt steady within it. Emily called again and again, her voice swinging between pleading and venom. Some days she begged me to reconsider, to undo the changes to the will, to return things to the way they used to be. Other days she lashed out with insults, accusing me of being cruel, selfish, even ungrateful. The irony of that last word nearly made me laugh. For decades I had given without expecting thanks, and now she hurled ungrateful at me as though it were a weapon. When her words didn't sway me, her silence did. A week passed, with no calls, no knocks on my door. For a moment, I thought she had accepted it. But Emily was never one to surrender. One Saturday morning, I heard frantic knocking at my door. When I opened it, she stood there, mascara streaked down her cheeks, hair tangled from crying. David lingered behind her, looking beaten down by exhaustion. "Dad, please," she said, her voice breaking. "We're drowning. The bank's been calling. We can't keep up. If you pull out, we'll lose the house." Her words should have softened me. Once upon a time, they would have. But as I looked at her standing in my doorway, I saw not the helpless child I once cradled, but a grown woman who had chosen arrogance over gratitude. I saw a woman who had mocked my sacrifices, who told me I suffocated her, who wished I would disappear. "You said you wanted freedom," I told her calmly. "This is freedom. No more strings. No more control. You are on your own, Emily, just as you wanted." She shook her head violently. "That's not what I meant. I was angry. I said things I didn't mean. You can't do this to me." "I'm not doing anything to you," I replied, my voice steady as steel. "I'm simply stepping back. You built your life on my shoulders, and now you have to stand on your own." Her knees buckled, and she sank onto the chair by my kitchen table, sobbing. David rubbed his temples, avoiding my gaze, perhaps realizing that the house he had once bragged about at parties was slipping through their fingers. For the first time in years, I didn't feel guilt watching them. I didn't feel the urge to reach into my pocket and fix everything. What I felt was clarity. "Dad, I need you," she whispered finally, her voice so soft I almost missed it. "No, Emily," I said quietly. "You don't need me. You need the version of me who never said no, who gave until he had nothing left. That man is gone." Her sobs filled the room, but I didn't waver. After years of bending, I was finally standing tall. When they left, the apartment felt strangely peaceful. I knew the storm was far from over. There would be consequences. There would be fallout. But inside me, the decision was made. I was not retreating. I was not surrendering. I was reclaiming my life. Weeks later, I packed 2 suitcases. One with clothes, the other with keepsakes. Photos of Emily when she was still a little girl. Letters from my late wife. Small reminders of a life that, though painful, had been filled with moments of love. I didn't hate Emily, and I never would, but I could no longer sacrifice myself for someone who saw my love as chains. When the taxi pulled up, I looked around my apartment one last time. It wasn't much, but it had been mine. For the first time, I wasn't leaving out of obligation. I was leaving for myself. As the plane lifted into the sky hours later, bound for Switzerland, I felt a strange mixture of grief and exhilaration. I had walked away from my daughter, my family, my old life. But in doing so, I had walked toward something greater, my own freedom. Emily's house would eventually slip through her fingers. She would move into a smaller place, stripped of the luxury she had flaunted. Maybe then she would finally face responsibility. Maybe then she would understand that a father's love is not endless, that gratitude is not optional. But whether she did or not, I no longer tied my worth to her choices. I had walked away with only 2 suitcases, but inside me was something I hadn't carried in decades: dignity, peace, and the beginning of an entirely new life. When I stepped off the plane in Switzerland, the crisp alpine air filled my lungs like a tonic. For 72 years, I had lived for someone else, my daughter, my late wife, the family I tried to hold together through sacrifice. But now, with only 2 suitcases rolling behind me, I felt like a man reborn. The mountains loomed in the distance, tall and immovable, and for the first time in decades, I felt just as steady. I rented a small apartment overlooking a lake, its surface shimmering under the morning sunday. The place was simple white walls, wooden floors, a narrow balcony with a view that made my chest ache with peace. Every morning, I would brew a cup of coffee, step outside, and watch the water ripple as the swans glided by. I had no obligations, no demands pressing at my door, no phone calls filled with guilt or expectation. Silence, once so heavy in my old apartment, now felt like a blessing. At first, I didn't know what to do with myself. My life had always been about fixing things, machines at the factory, problems for Emily, bills that threatened to crush us. Now, there was nothing to fix. The stillness was strange, but slowly, I began to embrace it. I joined a local book club, even though I hadn't read much beyond instruction manuals and bills for most of my life. The other members were kind, curious about the American retiree who listened more than he spoke. For the first time in years, people saw me not as a wallet or a crutch, but as a man with thoughts worth sharing. I also took watercolor classes at a small studio near the lake. My hands, once rough from years of tightening bolts and lifting steel, now held a paintbrush. The first strokes were clumsy, shaky, but with time, I found rhythm in the colors. I painted mountains, lakes, even the memory of Emily as a child holding her first slice of chocolate cake. Some nights, I stared at that painting with tears in my eyes, torn between sorrow and love. Friends began to form around me, neighbors who invited me to dinner, fellow retirees who shared their own stories of loss and renewal. There was comfort in knowing I wasn't alone in starting over late in life. Each story reminded me that pain can be a doorway, not just an ending. Meanwhile, news trickled in about Emily. I didn't go searching for it, but whispers found their way to me. The house I had once saved for her was gone, repossessed by the bank when they couldn't keep up with the payments. She and David moved into a smaller apartment, far from the prestige of the neighborhood she had once flaunted. For the first time in her life, Emily had to face responsibility without me as her safety net. I won't lie, part of me hurt to hear it. No father wants to see his child struggle, no matter how cruel she has been. But another part of me felt a deep sense of justice. Life had finally handed her what I never could, the chance to stand on her own. Did I feel joy at her hardship? No. What I felt was balance. For decades, the scales had been tipped unfairly, my sacrifices propping up her entitlement. Now, at last, they had leveled. One evening, as I sat on my balcony watching the sun dip behind the mountains, I thought about the word disappear. Emily had thrown it at me like a weapon, wishing me gone from her life. And in a way, I had disappeared from her house, her demands, her reach, but disappearing didn't mean dying. It meant transformation. I hadn't vanished into nothingness. I had stepped into the life I should have always lived. Sometimes, when the night is quiet and the lake reflects the stars, I still think of her. I think of the little girl who clung to my hand at the county fair, who twirled in her prom dress, who whispered thanks on her wedding day. I hold on to those memories because they are mine, untarnished by what came later. I love her still, though from afar, and perhaps I always will. But I no longer love her at the cost of myself. In Switzerland, I discovered something I never thought possible at my age. Joy. Real, unfiltered joy. In books, in paintings, in friendships, in the simple act of waking up without dread. I learned that it is never too late to reclaim your dignity, never too late to start again. And so, while Emily's world grew smaller, mine expanded. While she struggled with the weight of her choices, I learned to breathe freely for the first time in years. I didn't set out to punish her. I set out to save myself. And in doing so, I discovered that sometimes the greatest gift a parent can give a child is not endless sacrifice, but the lesson that even love has boundaries. Sometimes, the hardest truth a parent must face is that love without respect becomes a cage. For years, I believed being a good father meant giving without end my time, my money, my very body until it broke. I thought if I just sacrificed enough, my daughter would see my devotion and return it with love. But love that isn't met with gratitude becomes a burden, and sacrifice without acknowledgement becomes invisible. When Emily told me that the best gift would be for me to disappear, I thought my life was over. I thought those words were the death of everything I had built. But what I learned is that disappearing in her eyes wasn't the end, it was the beginning. It was the rebirth of a man who had forgotten his own worth. By stepping back, by saying no, I didn't just save myself. I gave her the freedom she claimed to want, and I gave myself the peace I had long denied. To anyone listening, I want you to remember this. You are more than the sacrifices you make. You are more than the wallet you open, more than the shoulders you offer for others to stand on. Your worth is not measured by how much you give until you're empty. True love, true family, is built on respect and gratitude, not entitlement. If you are a parent who has given everything, I want you to hear me clearly. You are allowed to choose yourself. You are allowed to say no. You are allowed to live for the years you still have, not just for the people who take you for granted. Choosing yourself is not selfish. It is survival. And if you are a child listening to this, remember, the love your parents give you is not endless. They are human, fragile, and deserving of kindness. Don't wait until it's too late to tell them you're grateful. In the end, disappearing from someone's life may look like loss, but sometimes it is the greatest act of healing for both of you. If this story touched your heart, I ask you to stay with me, to support this journey of stories about fathers, families, and the truths we often keep hidden. Together, we can honor the sacrifices that deserve to be remembered and remind the world that love without respect is not love at all.